Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. I want to welcome you to the second event in the 2025 Champinefu series. The title of tonight's presentation is Indigenous Placekeeping Through Tea with David Harrelson. If you missed it, the first event in our series was in October and it was held in person at Prax. It focused on the future of Indigenous foods in the Kalapuya homeland. If you'd like to watch the video of that event, you may do so at the link that I am about to share in the chat. Give me just a moment to do that. There it is. So the third and final event in our series will also be held virtually on December 3rd at 7 p.m. as well. It's titled Indigenous Placekeeping Through Tarweed, and you can register for that this is a free event, of course. You can register for it at the link that I am also about to share in the chat. Give me a moment to do that. And there that one is. If you're curious, you can also watch past videos from previous years of the Champinefu series at this next link that I am also going to share in the chat, believe it or not. Here it comes. There we go. All right, so as I'm sure that you've noticed, we're using Zoom tonight. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll try to answer some of those questions at the end. You usually click or tap on the question mark to submit your questions, depending on the type of device you have. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over now to Dave Eckert. He's the program chair for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club. He's going to tell us more about the series and join us on screen. There he is. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's always a joy to work with you and for all these years now. And so we've been doing this since 2017, and so it's been a wonderful experience all around for me anyway, and I hope for other people. And the purpose is to build understanding and relationships with the people, the Champinefu people, and the land of Champinefu, and the people of the Grand Ronde. And so anyway, here we go. It all started just after the Lamprey Creek Awakening in 2016. David Harrelson and I had a little discussion of, well, where can we go with something more than just what we did at Lamprey Creek? And he said, how about some kind of presentations? And here we are 9 years later. And David has been a joy to work with ever since. And he always comes up with new presentations and presenters every year. That's his job, is figuring out what the subjects are and what the presenters are, and every year it really excites me, and I'm always surprised what he comes up with. So I'm going to very quickly, as fast as my computer will allow me to do, go through the many presentations that we've had, and I'm only going to stop and talk about one. So here we go. And here's where I'm going to stop for a minute and reintroduce David. With this one back in 2023, the Ancestral Highway presentation is kind of unique in this series in that something very special and very real and very action oriented is about to occur, and David's going to make an announcement. So, David, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. It's really wonderful to be able to share with all of you the news that we just had that came in. Some of you may have known, and some of you have probably even contributed to the effort. But Dr. Lahui Whitebear invited Dave Eckert and the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition to do some fundraising to be able to realize having a place-based canoe at OSU with the Indigenous Studies program. And that effort started within this last year, and the funds have officially been raised to commission a canoe to be built by Brian Crable for the OSU Indigenous Studies program. And we are really immensely grateful to all the individuals, the organizations, different colleges from the university stepped forward, individual faith-based organizations throughout Corvallis and Champinefu, as well as just other civic groups of people that come together and contribute to community. And while it'll take time to have the canoe built and actualized to get on the water and support placekeeping practices in Corvallis and indigenous ways of the canoe, we're immensely grateful to the community and just want to share this success with you. Back to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you, David. And it's an example of how a program can really excite people to actually do something. And that's what we're hoping with this. So moving on. And this was the one last month at the Brax. And to make all this happen, once Dave has selected the subjects and the presenters, then the co-sponsors step in to really do the work to make this program a reality. And the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club was the initial community sponsor back in 2017. And that same year, the OSU Spring Creek Project stepped forward. And so we had two sponsors the first year. And then the public library came through and have been running our technical webinars, the technical portions of our webinars. The coalition has stepped up and really provided not only funding, but a lot of relationship building on all of this and connections. And the last one stepped up was the School of Language, Culture, and Society, which houses the OSU Indigenous Studies program. And this has been a real joy to work with them because they add a whole new element to our co-sponsorship with all the professional backgrounds they have. And as Bonnie so clearly said, is that the next one we're going to have after this is the tarweed for placekeeping. And a lot of people have heard of tarweed but don't know anything about it. And so that's what this is going to clear up, and really, why is it important? So this brings me to introducing David Harrelson, who you just heard. But David is just one of the, I don't know if there's anybody in Oregon who's in more demand than David, and we're always so honored that he comes here. Now, I don't know if it helps that he has his ancestors are from Champinefu, but I hope that helps because it's always a joy to have David and his creativity and energy and knowledge. David, take it away with Indigenous tea.
All right, thank you, Dave. I'm gonna share screen and get my PowerPoint going so you have wonderful visuals to look at as we get going with this presentation. Placekeeping through tea is the talk that I'm going to be giving today. You're looking at the leaves of a few month old Camellia sinensis or tea plants that have been sprouted by seed in a large container tray. And every day they get misted twice a day in order to grow them. So you're looking at this pretty picture of tea leaves that we took to capture our process of growing tea, not from this place, but tea that makes the tea that many people drink when they drink tea. Let's see. There we go. This is a better picture. We'll stay here. So Dave said that I pick all the talks, but what's a little misleading about that, and I want you all to think that I just pick myself to talk with you about things, is that Dave and I talk about a lot of things, and Dave was like, this tea thing, you need to talk about it. Like, it's really interesting. And I was like, okay, I guess I can do that, Dave. So with Dave's encouragement, I agreed to talk about tea, which is really a personal project that I'm passionate about. But if you've come to visit or gathered at Chichalu, there's a chance that you've sat down with me and I've shared tea with others, or in conversation, you maybe learned or heard about some of my passion for tea. And if you haven't, I look forward to that being able to happen. Um, in a traditional sense, as a Kalapuya person introducing myself and leading into this topic, it's really important to just name like my teachers, like the people that I just want to call into the room and acknowledge for like the assistance and like what they've offered to me in my pursuit of learning about tea. One is just my ancestors, the Kalapuya people of this place. And within that is maybe a specific ancestor, which is the brother to my great-great-grandmother, Maggie Bean, or Maggie Menard. And her brother is Lindsay Menard, who is known to enjoy Indian tea. And when I started drinking tea as my beverage of choice, my grandmother told me about her uncle, or right, her great uncle, who loved tea. And it turns out she had his teapot, and she gave me that teapot. That was Lindsay Menard's teapot. And we'll talk a little bit more about Lindsay Menard later, but really this connection sparked my curiosity to pursue what was meant by Indian tea, because my great uncle loved his Indian tea. Robbie Croninson is the co-owner of Bardo Tea, and he's really shown me remarkable tea from mainland China and Taiwan, as well as other places, and just shared knowledge of life as a tea merchant. He's showed me what tea masters can produce, the best of the best tea that's available in the world. My good friend Gavin McFarland, who's the tea maker at Minto Island, which is the only large-scale commercial, large is modest, is the only real commercial producer of tea leaf grown in Oregon, and he's their tea maker. And he's been instrumental in just showing me what can be made of tea here in Oregon and how to grow the plants. Like, how do these things work? I also really admire his pursuit of this idea of like a cascade style of tea, and actually thinking about and branding a style of tea that's recognizable kind of broadly across our region. And then last but certainly not least is my friend Balaz Hanger, who's a tea maker. And he's really shown me the potential and success to be had in applying tea processing techniques that he's learned from China and North Vietnam and elsewhere to native plant material here in the Pacific Northwest. His spring alder tea is processed in the style of black tea, and it's something truly exceptional, and it's what's in my glass tonight if you have me catch a glimpse of me drinking tea. Tea. What is tea? Now, you're looking at a picture of what we call two leaves in a bud on the left, the leaves in the hand. That's typically most teas that we think of that are fine grade loose leaf tea are picked as two leaves in a bud. It's when the plant forces growth in the spring and flushes, you're picking that supple, tender, energy-filled plant material, and then you're processing it. On the right, you're seeing a tea tray after a really good tea sitting with 3 different types of tea. But you'll note that I've placed the 2 leaves in a bud of the tea in the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner. And what helps you give context is that leaves like the thing on the right, through different processes, is what creates the leaf material that's been steeped here in the green, in the deep black, and then in the reddish or brown notes and colors. What many people don't realize is that all tea styles can essentially be made from the same leaf, and it has to do with how you process those. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that to create the understanding, but I should probably back up too and say, when I'm talking about tea, I'm talking very specifically about, in this case, plant or a beverage made from Camellia sinensis or Camellia sinensis variation assamica. Other things that are steeped in water are referred to as tisanes or infusions. But here, where we don't have as evolved of a tea culture, I would say, or it's more of a fringe thing, not many people see that. We describe our cup of chamomile before we go to bed as our tea, or this. Tea is this very generic word that gets applied to a lot of things. But within the tea world, talking about tea specifically from the Camellia sinensis plant is what people refer to as tea, which in effect would make all of my Indian teas actually Indian infusions or Indian tisanes. I still use tea because that's the way that my ancestors referred to it, as Indian tea. But I think that it's a value to just sort of distinguish that and understanding like what we're talking about. And what I'm talking about is taking processing techniques that have been developed for tea on the Camellia sinensis plant, applying those practices to other plant material that we would call infusions or tisanes. People the world over have steeped plants in water for things like medicine and nutrition and taste, and the same is the case for the Kalapuya people of here, of the Willamette Valley. However, today, some of the most developed and refined techniques for processing plant material really exist in China and Japan, the world over. And there's an incredible nuance of temperature and touch and feel in order to draw flavor compounds or fix flavor compounds so that you don't lose them. And that creates some really unique things. Here in Oregon, many of the processing techniques for our plant materials, if they were ever developed or known, aren't really documented through that window of loss that we experienced. That if you've watched some of our other presentations, you know, there's a history of understanding what colonialism and settler moving in and displacement of tribal people happened. And so there's a narrowing of information that's occurred. And I believe that there's probably certain things that we don't have anymore, but it doesn't mean that we can't search it out and look for those things or ways of doing. And I'll talk more about that later. There's many different styles of tea that come out of Asia or Japan or other places. They're described as black tea, green tea, white tea, yellow tea, purple tea. Maybe some of you have heard words like pu'er, which is fermented tea. There's ripe pu'er, there's raw pu'er. They call it shu or they call it sho, right? These are all styles of tea, and there's ways. The way that you achieve those is a basic explanation of tea. You pluck those leaves, you wither the leaves to a certain weight. Maybe like a black tea might be something like 50% or a third to 50% of the total weight of the plant. You let it just evaporate off the leaves. And then once that happens, you actually can roll the leaf. So by hand, you form it into a ball and you roll it, and you're essentially breaking all the individual cells in the plant. And when you do that, then the juice comes up in the material itself, but you're not breaking the leaves so it doesn't seep out. It kind of oozes out and it melds with the other parts. And then you need to find a way to oxidize to a certain level. And then you have to stop oxidization. And you can stop oxidization by doing things like steaming it, by cooking it in a wok, by rapidly drying it, right? These are all qualities. Then sometimes after you've fixed it, then you'll further toast it or dry it. and a whole nother process that adds like char or cooking to the actual processed leaf material. In other ways, then even after all that's done, sometimes it's wetted again and fermented, or these others. So there's many different avenues of processing. The other thing that I didn't talk about is in the same way that we can have the same species of, let's say, a grape varietal, but there's different cultivars of that produce completely different flavor compounds. And in areas like China and Japan and other locations, they've isolated individual cultivars that are really desirable for certain types of tea. So you'll hear about cultivars specifically to make really good green tea, or to make an oolong, or to make pu'er tea. There's all of this kind of math that goes into it, and we're not really doing that much over here. Our genetic material is kind of all over the place and about if it works or if it doesn't, but yet we're still able to make some really unique and special teas. Okay, so probably what most of you thought that we were going to talk more about, which is some of what these are pictures of what I think are some of the most promising native plants as tea here in the Northwest. I think a really important grounding is that in the way that our creation stories talk about the world, every single plant and living organism has something to be in relationship with people for. It's like the ethos of like how our world is created. There's nothing that's worthless. There's things of lesser use and lesser value, things that you don't use as often as other things, but every single thing in the natural world has the ability to be of value, to be in relationship with as a human, and that was set in order before humans ever came into this place. And so I think what's interesting about that is it's all about frequency or exposure or preparation, right? Plants like the red elderberry, right? It's semi-toxic, but if you process it in the correct way, you can isolate that. And in our archaeology sites, you find tons of red elderberry seeds, even though it's semi-toxic, right? And it begs this question of, it's because people know how to be in relationship with it. It doesn't mean that you can just go out and eat a bunch of red elderberry. So this brings me to this point that there's, the primary focus of my talk today, and mostly what I'm willing to share with other people, is about taste. There's many plants that you can use for medicinal purposes, and some people get really oriented towards tea for medicinal activities, and I think that that's a very worthwhile endeavor, but it's also potentially very dangerous out of context. For instance, some of the plants that we steep and use as medicine, you're only supposed to use when the seasons change. So you would only drink that tea up to 4 times a year. And it's because while it has beneficial properties, it also has other things that if you drank it consistently over time, you'd probably cause some real damage to some of your internal organs. So with all of that said, there's 4 plants that I really want to draw attention to, that I'll talk to as we go on, that have the ability to, not only are they abundant and readily available, but they're also these types of teas that like can be everyday drinking teas. You're not dealing with the complications that if somebody drank it every single day, they might actually have like problems that happen in their life, because too much of a good thing is still too much of a good thing. And these plants from left to right here are fireweed, which is an introduced plant. It's from Europe, but it grows all over in our forested lands. Another visitor is the Himalayan blackberry, which can make an incredibly tasty tea, which I'll talk about the descriptions later. You have sometimes called Oregon tea or yerba buena in the center with the little white flowers. And then you have red alder shoots, the spring red alder shoots in the upper right. So now that you know what you're looking at, I'm going to back way up and say that when I was told that my great uncle drank Indian tea, that would seem like we were all talking about the same thing. And then I learned pretty rapidly that there's 3 teas that plants that regularly get called Indian tea here in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. One of them is Yerba Buena, this picture in the middle with the white flowers. The others are Trapper's tea and Labrador tea. And Labrador tea grows in sort of marshy wetlands out on the coast and in some other places. Trapper's tea grows more out into the mountains and in the east. Yerba Buena really loves these oak savanna habitats and fringe habitats in between liminal space of like prairies and forests. It really likes to grow on the edge, like edge effect. It's really into those spaces. Well, then I had to do some sleuthing, and then I ultimately figured out that the Indian tea that Lindsay Menard really liked had to be Yerba Buena. And that's because it was noted that he would go right out back of his little cabin and pick Yerba Buena. And while his cabin is no longer there, I know where it was on the reservation. And there's a little spring in that location. And all around the spring grows this plant, Yerba Buena. So I was able to confirm back through time of almost 100 years without any actual physical human contact that this plant community that was right next door to where my great-great-uncle lived is very likely the Indian tea that we talk about, not the Trapper's tea or Labrador tea, where there really isn't a good climate, let alone I have not been able to find populations of those on the reservation. You know, besides medicine, besides flavor, another main reason that people have is nutrition to drink teas. One of those, or a couple examples that are really powerful, are spring dug fir tips, as well as stinging nettle shoots in the spring. And those are oftentimes consumed to fortify the body for the season change and the real hard work that comes ahead. And so there's different properties of those plants that are very advantageous about coming out of the winter and going into the spring. And you'll see people do that. There's a wonderful podcast called Old Growth Table, where a native nutritionist who's from up north in Salish territory, I believe she's Muckleshoot, Valerie Seacrest, hosts that podcast. And she has some really wonderful talking about native plants. And I recommend that podcast to anyone interested in native plants and living cultural traditions and practices with those plants. That's a new podcast with only a couple of episodes. So these plants that I talked about and really their qualities. So what does a tea of fireweed taste like? Well, a lot of it has to do with how you prepare it. And a part of that is that you have to let it sit in little piles that are of a specific size that the piles produce enough heat when you leave them over a period of time during processing. And that heat actually cures and brings out the flavors. But if your pile is too big, it gets too hot and it burns out the desirable floral compounds. If it's too small, then it doesn't produce enough heat to actually open up the floral compounds. And so these are this example of how a processing technique that was really practiced extensively. In this case, it's not even a Chinese tradition, but it's actually like a Hungarian tradition, an Eastern European tradition of making really good fireweed tea. And it has to do with withering, rolling, processing, and then leaving in these little heaps that lock in the flavor. But getting the size right really makes a difference in producing so-so fireweed tea versus really exceptional, very floral, abundant tea. Yerba Buena, which I do believe is the most promising of all of our plants for a tea, is minty, but what's peculiar about it is instead of being cooling on the palate, it's warming. And whenever I share this plant with chefs or others, they find it to be a real surprise because we're used to having mint-like flavors be cooling on our palates, not warming. And it's one of the things that are very special about Yerba Buena. Blackberry leaf, spring shoots, all that energy that's pushing up, right, from these huge masses of these hedges that grow everywhere. Well, if you process it like black tea, it ends up tasting remarkably like maple syrup and pancakes, right? And so you have this amazing dried processed leaf that will still stick you because it's got its little thorns on it, and it tastes like maple syrup and pancakes. Yet alder leaf, which is not, we know that yerba bueno is an indigenous tea that our ancestors used. I can find some references to alder being used medicinally, but not as an everyday drinking tea. And my friend Balazs Hanger, while watching the deer and what they were eating in the spring, he noticed that deer won't eat older alder because it upsets their stomach, but they will eat the fresh spring shoots. And as a result, he started to make tea from it, and it produces this absolutely amazing rose, highly reminiscent of rose flavor. And yet it has a deep body, similar to if you've ever had um, the bush tea from South Africa, which I'm forgetting the name of it right now, rooibos tea. It has texture to it. That's the thing that a lot of our other steeped plants, like, they don't have the body that Camellia sinensis tea has. Rooibos has a little bit, but not nearly as much as alder. Alder actually feels like a full cup in your mouth of like abundant rose flavor. So this has really become a term that's coming up in a lot of our presentations and topics. And a part of it is that a lot of the work that's happening around keeping Indigenous cultures living and alive within our community of Grand Round, and to an extent, I think that this principle can apply a lot more broadly, is doing this Indigenous placekeeping work. And as a definition, I'm just reading what's on the page, but it's a form of engagement that prioritizes ecological, historical, and cultural relationships to place while bringing the presence of Indigenous histories and futures into focus. So as I've talked with you about, different ways of knowing or doing or being, or even the story of my great uncle, right? This is like his relationship with the ecological world that was around him, and he drank this tea. And today I can drink that tea and I can know that it was the flavors that my great uncle was experiencing. There's also a definition of just placekeeping. So we're sort of adding this on as Indigenous is doing these things in mind of like a group of people that are place-based in nature. But the practice of placekeeping is also just a practice that it can be applied by anyone. You don't have to be Indigenous. And placekeeping is the active care and maintenance of a place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there. It is not just preserving buildings, but the ability of local people to maintain their way of life as they choose. This is a definition from the 501c3 nonprofit called the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. And the definition comes from the field of urban planning and is a direct response to the use of the term placemaking. Placemaking sort of presents some problematic issues, and there's been a lot of commentary about placemaking as being, oh, we're going to intentionally define this place, but then we're going to bring a lot of these biases that we have along with us, like racism and whether it be intended or unintended gentrification and class, and sort of making a world in a way that a group of people want it to be, but then the equality raises issues and concerns of that as people define the community what they want to have, but then who are they including, who are they excluding? Whereas this practice of placekeeping is sort of celebrating what is the commonalities of this place and what does it hold through time and history. So Champinefu as a lecture series inherently is placekeeping, because what it's doing is it's taking Indigenous knowledge and knowing of the place known as Champinefu and the people that live there, and trying to connect those knowledge sets through time while convening people to gather together to learn about the things of the past in hopes that they might find relevancy of how those things can be applied today. So I do a lot of this placekeeping stuff, and if you're not familiar with me and my work, I'll say that I've worked for my tribe, the Grand Round tribe, for over 20 years. I started off as a wildland firefighter, and then I moved into cultural resources work. I've collaborated to protect numerous gathering areas and village sites of my people. We opened a museum, created a research center for tribal members and the greater public, and more recently supported the growth of Indigenous artists and recognition of Indigenous place-based art forms through the creation of a public art program for the Grand Round tribe. So Indigenous placekeeping is really at the core of all of this. And not only of my work, but also outside of work, because I always am curious and pick up projects. And that's really where tea comes in for me. I'm engaged in placekeeping through teaching and sharing with my kids, and personal projects like learning to grow and process tea. So I want to make a case to basically say that I think that we can do Indigenous placekeeping through tea. It goes back to the outcome of some of the other talks that I've given for the Champinefu lecture series, to say that we have new inputs and we have new desired outcomes. To be Indigenous doesn't require us to be static in the past. It's actually very Indigenous to adapt and to do new things and to be inventive. Our people in many ways were even cosmopolitan in the nature that they adopted new ideas readily from others. They applied it. They were engaged in trade networks spanning throughout our entire region. We have terminology that can help us through that. Like, we do want to honor the way that our ancestors did things, and we can call that ancestral. But where change has either been required or we find it convenient yet still authentic to what it is that we're doing, we can use that word traditional. And yet we're not completely confined to have to be ancestral or traditional, right? We could be contemporary, we could be modern, right? We could push things, and we can still find ways to do that in a way that's authentic and that our community receives, right? Our community ultimately gets to enforce whether we've gone too far, right? We've gone rogue, we've gone fringe, we're doing something that doesn't seem true to the old worlds and the teachings and who we are as a people, and there isn't a case to be made. But then again, maybe there is. And I think that how I think about this pursuit of why I ultimately decided to grow a tea garden is that I needed to be able to make material, like make a tea from plant material, and know if I was making green tea or black tea from that plant material that it originated from. So then when I try to apply that technique to a different plant, I actually know that I'm doing what was already refined over here someplace else. And that's what sort of set me off on this journey to grow out a bunch of plants, which I'll talk about in a second. But a big part of it for me is that I want to seek flavors potentially known to my ancestors, but for which a break has occurred because of the radical change experienced by my people over the last 15 generations. If a flavor is not something known to them that's found, then may it be worth being known to people 15 generations from now. So I'm not trying to grasp at just would-be things in the past, but doing the work and the understanding to try to create and find things to share that are of this place or have become of this place or have this story that are worth people knowing about 15 generations or even further out into the future. And I think that that sort of pursuit of flavor is a worthwhile endeavor. The other thing about seeking flavor through tea is this continuation of the richness of relationship between plants and people. And to better understand a plant and know its gifts, it obligates, in our teachings, a person partaking in its wealth to care for it. So if I'm becoming a recipient of the abundance and the wealth that a plant provides me value, then it obligates me to know about that plant and be in relationship and take care of it and ensure that it does well in the world. And by finding ways to value these plants, you can be in relationship with them. And I think that that is one of those worldviews that can help us move forward in time to more broadly recognize the human-plant relationships and interaction. But yet, this crazy idea, which I've alluded to throughout this talk, is that I eventually got a wild enough hair that my wife and I decided that we needed to do our own test plot to know whether you could really grow Camellia sinensis here in Oregon. There's some other people who had established it, but the 3 years of establishment, 3 to 4 year, 5-year establishment period, the plants are really vulnerable. And what was very clear is that once you get them established, they have really deep root structures. Like, you're probably never going to be able to kill them, even if you wanted to. But the initial establishment period is a real unique challenge for this species. This is in a backyard. It's like a 1/4 acre lot in a residential neighborhood. And it had a hedge around the outside, which is really important and valuable because wind is one of your greatest challenges with tea because it really, really likes humidity. And if it gets dried out, it won't do well. And wind is one of the fastest ways to do that. In order to grow tea, we sent away for tea seeds and we grew all of our starts in those large tubs that I spoke about. And we ultimately decided to settle on 8 rows of 8 double rows of 1-foot spacing of 4 different cultivars. The cultivars that we're growing are Black Sea and Sochi, which are both varietals that come out of the Russian Soviet agricultural programs that were growing in the Caucasus. And we're growing a Taiwanese oolong, although that plant row really didn't do well, which is disappointing. And we also have some Korean green tea clones that we were able to get from a friend who were growing them. I am going to actually we're going to take a short break because I have an alarm going off in the other room and I apologize, but it's really distracting. I'll be right.
Well, maybe I can take up a little right here until David comes back. And just my wife Annette Mills and I were just talking about how we think this is one of the most forward-thinking ones. Oh, the alarm is off. Okay.
Thanks. Sorry, Dave. Yeah, I apparently forgot that there was an alarm set for 8 o'clock. Okay, so yeah, this is the tea garden. This is the beginning. This spring will be year 3 of the tea garden. We're on Instagram. It's called the Dundee Hills Tea Garden, and the picture of the current tea garden is on the right. I should describe that those are just hoop poles that we either put shade cloth on whenever we get over like 105, 110 degrees during this establishment period. We shade our plants to protect them from sunburn. And then in the winters, when we get really colder than 25 degrees over a consistent period of time, or we're going to have a heavy snow that could break our branching structures, we put out our frost cloth, which is lots of rolling things up and unrolling things and other things. But yeah, so you're looking at that also for a period of time, which was a very poor decision that probably more of you were farmer types than me. I have children, young children, and I was like, wow, it'd be really great to just put down some of this cloth and not have to weed it, and it helped us with spacing. The awful idea of why that is that it just harbors voles. And it's absolute awful habitat for voles. And if I could have gone back in time, I would have never put black cloth down on the ground, although it seemed really smart until the voles moved in. And now I feel like I'm earning my chops and trying to grow things and compete with the world of how it moves around. And as a reminder, this is all really just a way to try to responsibly, at a small scale, of also convenience, get enough plant material regularly that I can practice plant processing techniques. So then once I perfect them on Camellia sinensis and I know I'm achieving what I think is desirable from those, then I can turn around and go and gather native plants and do similar like activities to them. It didn't seem responsible to do that in any sort of scale in a non-growing environment without first testing. And so it'll take me about 5 years from the inception of the idea of growing seeds in order to do my first harvest, likely this spring, where I actually get my first leaf material. But I've sort of dedicated into this idea of refinement and learning, but I've had to grow the material in order to be able to work with it. And I think that these are sort of creative ways of placekeeping, which is, well, why are you growing a plant that isn't from here in order to practice? And it's really about looking at different ways to be in relationship with the plants that we have. Plants like these plants, which these plants are, right? They're native, they're new visitors, right? But they're here. Like, we're not getting rid of fireweed, we're not getting rid of blackberry. And so I think embracing this idea of finding ways to be in relationship with these plants is really important. There is some reading that are some great books about botany for people that are interested about the topic of native plants and their use. You'll get more examples of different medicinal qualities and things of that nature. The most recently published book is Gifted Earth, which is an ethnobotany of the Quinault tribe, which is a southwest Washington tribe with a lot of similar ecological environment to what we have here in the Willamette Valley as well as the coast. The Pacific Northwest Foraging is a more broad encompassing book, almost like a pendium or update to the Pojar McKinnon like field guide book, but more focused on like edible foods and things of the sort, as opposed to just the botanical world. And then if you're interested in more like essays of understanding traditions of plant use and cultivation on the Northwest coast, this collection of essays by Doug Dewar and Nancy Turner, Keeping It Living, is a great example. And I have noticed now that I recommended 3 books by Doug Dewar, but if you aren't familiar with Doug, I would check out his work. He's done a lot of different publishing through the years with Oregon State University Press, but Doug is a wealth of knowledge and one of our previous presenters as well on the Champinefu series. But that is my presentation about Indigenous placekeeping through tea, and I am available to take questions. I'll leave you on these pretty plants. All right. Well, there was, I'll type the answer for the podcast is the podcast that I recommended was Old Growth Table by Valerie Seacrest. There was a question about the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It a wonderful book. She also has an updated book about service berries, or not an updated, but her latest book is about service berries, which takes on that topic of reciprocity. And Robin actually has a strong relationship with some of the faculty at the School of Forestry, and regularly has come out to OSU and given presentations. And last spring, I actually had the honor to spend a few days camping out with Robin and sharing and talking. And she really does have an insightful way of talking about things. So yeah, that'd be another kind of more generalized theory feeling side of topics about native plants to take a look at. Let's see, we've got irrigation for the tea garden. It is true, during establishment, it needs water. And it's a small enough space that I actually put out like standard yard water sprayers, and I use 3 of them, and I turn it on for about 15 minutes on hot days during the summer. And that generally gets us enough of what we need. Oh, sweetened tea. Yeah, there is that question. I think that I used to be a beekeeper till I developed an allergy to bees. Um, and that, yeah, it's good to use honey. It's sort of a preference thing. I think when you really get into taste, honey ends up like changing the flavors that you're tasting. It's kind of like salting your food, right? It makes it really lovely, but sometimes it makes it harder to taste what it is because it's just salty. But yeah, honey's a nice thing. Hawthorn berries. I think that hawthorn berries, just like many other, it's like they have a use. It's just about like frequency and other activities. And because different plants can have different medicinal properties that could be complicated with somebody's individual health, like I'm really reluctant on certain things to make recommendations because it's just really dependent on um, an individual person. And there's a lot of herbalists and many acupuncturists also do herbalism, and those are people that their knowledge is valuable and seek them out. But I'm not seeking to like be that type of person. Pacific Northwest ideal climate for teas. When it comes to Camellia sinensis, we're right on probably the border of what works. To give you a comparison, my plants, when they're planned to be producing, will probably only produce 6 to 8 weeks a year. I'll probably get a flush every 5 to 7 days. And in contrast, in places like India or China, they can be in full production for 8 months out of the year. And so there really is a limitation in like, even if you can grow it here, it doesn't mean that you can make it incredibly abundant. The other part is probably the area that's showing to be the most promising in the United States right now is actually the South. Mississippi, one of the tea companies that I'll call out is the Great Mississippi Tea Company. And the owners of that have been really instrumental in the U.S. League of Tea Growers and just propagating and sharing knowledge about how to grow tea in the United States. And we're actively involved in that, nationwide organization. But Mississippi in the South really seems, they have the humidities that are needed to really support larger harvest windows. And the questions are really pouring in, so I will start to answer them a little bit faster. Oh, about processing blackberry leaves into tea. Yeah, essentially following a practice of how black tea would be made. So if you find any books or other published material about processing, essentially you process it in the same way that black tea is processed. And that looks like withering the leaf, then rolling it, and drying it, essentially. common beverages, hot or cold. Yeah, yerba buena, really good water. I have it on good authority. Some of the best water that you can get from any springs is on Highway 26. For those of you that know the spring on Highway 26, I drove by it this weekend. Are the tea plants you're growing evergreen? Yes, so Camellia sinensis does keep leaves all year round, and its sort of natural environment is actually as an understory plant. And so you'll see that, and it's a really heavy nitrogen, so it pulls tons of nitrogen out of the soil, which is, if you saw my pictures, you may have seen that I had clover planted in between the rows because I'm trying to just not be as much of a nitrogen draw. But some of those tree species that fix nitrogen, very few, but are legume-like trees, those sometimes are often planted interspersed within larger tea fields as a way to try to fix nitrogen into the whole system. Fireweed native to the Northwest. I've seen a couple things about that. That would be an interesting, we do have a lot of things that get naturalized to a certain point where we think of them as endemic. But there's a lot of stuff that comes in. An example would be like we have our native hazelnut, but we also have filberts. And until recently, our agricultural hazelnuts and our native hazels, they weren't cross-pollinating because their pollination windows were further apart. And yet in some places down in like Ashland and Southern Oregon, now with how climate's changed, we're actually seeing that their pollination windows line up and then they end up kind of crossing. And I guess what my point is that my understanding of how it works with fireweed is that there's enough genetic material that's come in that's Eastern Europe based that it sort of brings question into this idea of endemic or what it is. And yet there's probably totally someone on here that knows about more than I do. So if I learn more, I'd be happy to learn more from any of you that want to send me an email to share what you know. Okay. Oh yeah. Dr. David Craig from Willamette, a good friend, always asks great questions, but about your dynamic of relationships to voles. So, right, in competition with non-human kin. Yeah, so it's really interesting to talk about things in theory, right? Like it's, managing for abundance and doing this, and then you create abundance, and then something tries to utilize that abundance, and it isn't you. And you have to like work through that, right? And it's definitely, and then you also have like, in my case, my wife, who I'm in partnership with this, who's like, you need to kill all those voles. They're eating our tea, right? And this is countless hours of like lots of labor doing all the things we have. Ultimately, I'm putting pressure on them. I haven't devolved into using awful poisons. A part of it is looking at an observation, and just trying to put pressure about things. So that's like ensuring that there's raptor habitat, right? That's like available, and looking at the ability to like put in poles and like how that would be effective. It's as like getting barn cats, right, that are available, which also I struggle with. Like I haven't gotten the cats yet because it's this whole web. Like I have a whole family of scrub jays that nest in our hedge. And scrub jays are really important culturally, and they leave me all these blue feathers all the time, and I love it. And the last thing I want to do is get two cats that are surely going to kill, fledgling blue jays in my yard that I absolutely love. And so at the end of the day, I've just kind of let the voles, well, I put pressure, I fill their holes with sand, right? I do things that are like mildly nuisance to them, but they've so far just spread. And I'm really hoping this winter knocks them back. And if it doesn't, it's going to be it might not be viable. I might not be able uh, to be able to grow where I'm growing. Or what I've learned is, growing in clay soils, which I'm growing in clay soils, which are kind of a question mark. It's not as desirable, and potentially I might have less vole challenge if I was growing in more sandy, loamy soils. But yeah, what I can tell you is that traps don't work, and the buzzing things are a laughing matter, and I think any farmer will also tell you that. But more conversations, Dave, and maybe you can give me some advice about raptors, inviting them into space. First harvest, I had a question about first harvest and planning my first non-trimming harvest this spring in 2026, probably sometime April to June. Cottage industry, the reason, so yeah, can tea, Camilla sinensis growing become a cottage industry? In the 1970s, Lipton, that we know for all their tea bags, actually did test plots all around the United States. And they did establish that tea can grow perfectly fine in many areas of the United States. And ultimately, what held it back was the labor market, in that at that time, not many mechanized ways of harvesting tea existed. And really, there's whole society and villages and community life, societal structure in India and China built around the harvest of tea. And one of the things that's happening globally right now that maybe could make growing tea as a commercial crop more viable in the United States is one, technology, mechanization, of which the Great Mississippi Company, Tea Company, have some really great examples of, like, mobile hedging devices and other things that they're using that I think are really inventive and interesting. The other is that the labor isn't as inexpensive in China and India. As China and India industrialize, people are leaving rural communities for better paying jobs in urban cores, and suddenly tea that used to cost $20 a pound in China or India can cost $100, $200 a pound. And really, the break point for profitability in the United States is you need to be able to sell tea somewhere at $100 to $150 a pound of dried tea. And yet that's real hard, because even today you can get um, low quality but still loose leaf tea for $5-10 a pound. And so, besides the novelty, I don't think you're going to get into that kind of price difference. The cottage industry maybe comes in the novelty of it. Um, I will say that the funny things that people do, like people started baking bread during the pandemic. This was totally a pandemic project, which is like, oh, our world's collapsing around us. We love tea. What happens if supply chains break down? And we're like, well, I guess we'll be able to make our own tea. So it was sort of a reliance thing for our own benefit. Checking. Oh, yeah. So Nache Barnes, who's shared a lot with us about Indigenous placekeeping, asked a question about all this work that you've done, but what would you consider success at the end of the 5-year period and beyond? Um, I'm already realizing one of the leaps of success, which is that, is this worth scaling? And that was the question that I wanted to have answered, and it was answered. And the answer is no, it's not worth scaling. um, and that's success, because I didn't try to, like, buy land and plant 2 to 5 acres of tea and get in way over my head. Instead, I had something at a very manageable scale. That is sort of the tea part of it. The other success is that I simply have both tea that I've made from Camilla sinensis and tea from native plants that I've made that I can share at my own community events, right? Whether that's a plank house gathering, whether that's people getting together at Chichalu, but just being able to be host with sharing beverage, like that's success for me. I'm reading through them. If I don't really have anything to say about it, I'm probably just passing because we have quite a few open right now. So I'm trying to work through the ones that I can answer. I do apologize if I'm not able to get to your questions. I'm probably, oh, we have a little bit of time though. Well, this is an interesting one. Could people have traded tea seeds and brought Camellia sinensis? Uh, I don't think that there's any evidence of that prior to time. Even tea first really begins moving out of China into India through the British, and the Russians also established, which is it's a curiosity. The Russians actually started to establish their tea fields in the Caucasus, in between the Black and Caspian Seas, at the same time that my ancestors were like signing treaties with the U.S. government in the 1850s. So that's that's an interesting endeavor. This is a good question. Eric Skadson asks, do you have concerns about a native tea like Yerba Santa becoming commercialized? And the plant I'm talking about is Yerba Buena, so it's probably just a name mix-up. Maybe there's also a Yerba Santa, but with Yerba Buena, part of the reason why I'm talking about it is it has a really amazing flavor. It's also inherently a very resilient and abundant plant. By me drawing attention to it, it spreads like rhizomes the way that strawberry does. It's one of these things that like people you it the more it's manipulated, the more it will become abundant. Like I don't think it actually puts the plant at risk. And I do actually think that farming would be really beneficial for that plant because you could grow it in vertical structures and actually have the whole piece come down. Um, I I I think it could become like within how you have herbs that get used in cooking. I've started to use it when I make salads or like a couscous dish or other things. Like I'm adding it in to flavor things the way that I would bay leaves or other activities and kind of keep those things living. So, there is a responsibility to not share those things that are vulnerable in their environments. But yerba buena is just not it's like how we wouldn't be worried about drawing too much attention to blackberry, like Himalayan blackberry. It's just so abundant. Uh, you, there's a question about how yerba buena is processed. You boil the leaf material, including the stalks, for 5 minutes at a full boil, and it extracts flavor, and then you pull out the material. It's I haven't begun to process yerba buena in the ways that are available to make different teas. It's one of the processes that will be interesting to explore. I've really only utilized yerba buena in the way that my ancestors cooked it and use it and know of it, which is that boiling process. It would be interesting. I think that there's the ability to produce different flavors potentially from it, like preparing yerba buena like black tea or green tea, or maybe even like a puer. And that's sort of some of the stuff that I'll be starting. But in order to do that, I'm not going to go out and just harvest tons of it from the hillsides to be able to try to get enough. You really need a certain quality to be able to roll and process. And so to do that, like I need to set up some sort of backyard grow operation, but I could probably do that in like an 8-foot small little greenhouse. Like you don't need a lot of space. The uses of yerba buena, It's sort of generally seen as a cure-all, but it's really just tasty. That warming minty flavor. Oh gosh, why can't there's a number of books about tea processing. There's a book that we absolutely love that's by the owner of Camilla Forest in North Carolina. And I don't have the name of the book, unfortunately, in front of me right now, but it's really a how-to guide. Camilla Forest also sells tea seeds, and those are one of the places where we bought some of our tea seeds that we grow. But yeah, there's whole books on the topic of like how to prune and harvest tea plants, and yeah. Oh, yeah, there was a question about any ethical, delicious tea producers you recommend we support. Yes, I don't sell tea. I'm not trying to be a tea merchant, right? I'm just exploring, walking through this. I will say that Bardo tea for tea from around the world is incredibly exceptional. They also are one of the few tea houses that carry the teas made by Balazs Hanger. Balazs is based out of Chehalis, Washington, but if you wanted to try the alder tea or the blackberry tea that's made by Balazs, he's the only person that I know in the Northwest that's commercially producing that, and that's available through Bardo Tea, which has an online shop that you can order from, and they also have a business on 27th and Killingsworth, I believe, in Portland, which is a wonderful little tea house. Those would really be the folks. Also, Minto Island Growers, based in South Salem, down on Minto Island. They have a wonderful place, and they do an open house every spring. If you follow them on social media, you can actually go into the tea fields and talk with their tea maker. There's the Tea Fest that happens in Portland and Eugene. We have two tea fests in our state that happen every single year, and you'll see all the different tea merchants and people that are selling all different types of things. And a number of you are putting in the question like different tea shops that are around, and there really are. Like in that regard, like we're pretty fortunate as a relatively small state in the United States. We have a pretty active tea scene going on. The really closest beyond Portland is Seattle and San Francisco, have other active kind of tea culture happening. Oh yeah, I did have some advice about snakes. Yes, I have built like a rock garden, basically. I went to the nearby quarry and got a bunch of stuff, but there was advice of putting old PVC pipes laid on their sides, and I like that too. So I'll add that to my pursuit. Ooh, and owls. Yes, I do like encouraging owls. Thank you for that. All right, folks. Let's see. Oh, there was a question. Is your tea garden the first time a tea growing experiment has been conducted in the Pacific Northwest? No, not at all. There has been a test plot. The mother plot at Minto Island was established in the 1970s, and there's been active genetic research that's been happening on tea plants since the 1970s here in Oregon. I've also learned of all different examples of people, including on one call I was on, there was actually somebody just south of Corvallis who would be interesting if he ever picks up and sees this. I would love to connect with him, but I don't have his contact information. But for at least I think 10 to 15 years, uh, he's a member of one of the farm families around or outside of Corvallis, and he's actually been actively keeping a tea stand. There's other hobbyists too that we have a winemaker that's growing tea up in the Eola Hills. Um, you know, the little test plots here and there are kind of what's happened, other than Minto Island Growers, which is, you know, made efforts to plant out a number of different fields, but have a little over, I think, like a 2-acre mother plot of tea plants. But yeah, if you want to see a really full size, or not a full size, but what feels like a full size when all I have is 500 plants, Minto Island is really the place to see that. Oh, thank you, Dawn Marie. You're so wonderful. Grow Your Own Tea by Christine Parks and Susan Walcott with Camilla Forest Nursery. They're all wonderful, helping me out. And I did, you know, a number was mentioned, but a few of you mentioned JT and Eugene. And yeah, they're really wonderful. I saw them at the last tea festival. Really friendly folks who do a lot of, you know, spread love about that. Also, the former president of the U.S. League of Tea Growers owns Oregon Tea Traders, also based out of Eugene. But thank you all for this evening and the opportunity to talk with you about native plants and tea, and hopefully we kind of leaned into that. And I guess I'll take one last look through everything. I think I did good. Oh, I had a Latin name for Yerba Buena, Cleanopodium douglasii. That guy Douglas, David Douglas, who got around and gave Latin names to everything. But yeah, Clinopodium, Clinopodium douglasii. And I'm probably mispronouncing it, but I'm not Latin, so I think I get to get away with that. Okay, everybody. Bonnie, did anybody need to do anything else, or are we just signing off? Okay.
I think we're just signing off and thanking you so much, David, for your time and for this amazing presentation. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.